What if the most powerful engine advantage of 2026 isn't illegal, isn't visible, and isn't something teams realized they were competing against until it was already too late? Because inside Formula One, there are quiet discussions suggesting Mercedes has interpreted one line of the rulebook in a way that completely changes how performance is created. Not by adding power, but by deciding when that power exists. Several teams now believe the single interpretation could lock them into years of chasing an advantage they can't copy without breaking their own projects. And the FIA has already looked at it. The uncomfortable truth is this. The detail that explains why this matters doesn't sound dramatic at first. But once you understand it, you'll never look at the 2026 engine rules the same way again. On the surface, the regulations look almost boring. 16:1 compression. Clear measurement procedures. Defined testing conditions. Everything written to remove ambiguity. That's why most teams treated this part of the rulebook as settled early on. They read it. They accepted it. And then they moved on to more visible performance areas. Mercedes didn't. They stayed right there, asking why the rule was written that way in the first place. The critical detail most people gloss over is not the number itself. It's the method. Compression is not measured dynamically. It's not checked at racing temperature. It's inspected cold, in controlled conditions, long before the engine ever feels real load. That distinction sounds trivial until you realize what it allows. Because an engine does not behave the same at 20 degrees as it does at 1,000. And Formula One engines live at 1,000. This is where the conversation inside technical departments becomes very quiet. Materials expand. But they don't all expand equally. Different alloys grow at different rates. Different shapes distort differently under heat and pressure. If you design for that deliberately, the engine you inspect is not the engine you race. Legally, it's the same unit. Functionally, it's not. And that gap between legality and behavior is where Mercedes appears to have invested most of its effort. Rivals who have looked into this say the concept isn't clever in a flashy way. It's brutal. It assumes perfect execution. It assumes confidence in simulations. It assumes you won't need regulatory intervention to survive. Because once you commit to this approach, everything else follows. Cooling strategies, internal tolerances, material sourcing, manufacturing precision. You don't dabble in this idea. You build your entire power unit around it. That's why the advantage, if real, is so dangerous. It's not something you can bolt on in a winter. It's not something you can half copy. Teams that didn't choose this path early would have to tear up concepts already locked under the cost cap. Budgets already spent. Suppliers already contracted. Timelines already compressed. By the time the advantage becomes obvious on track, the option to respond cleanly may already be gone. What adds another layer of tension is that the FIA has already examined the interpretation and found no violation. The rules say what they say, and Mercedes appears to be operating exactly within them. That puts everyone in an impossible position. Change the measurement process, and you admit the regulation was incomplete. Don't change it, and you risk entrenching an advantage that the cost cap makes almost impossible to close. Either way, the moment for a clean solution is already slipping away. And this is why teams aren't panicking publicly. Panic would confirm fear. Instead, they're watching, waiting, trying to determine whether this is a theoretical edge or a structural one. Because if it's structural, the consequences go far beyond 2026. They define who controls the next era, and whether the rest of the grid is chasing performance, or chasing a mistake they can never fully undo. Once this interpretation entered serious discussion, the mood inside rival factories shifted noticeably. What had started as curiosity turned into uncomfortable internal reviews. Engineers went back to their own concepts, not looking for extra power, but looking for assumptions they may have made too early. And what many of them found was unsettling. Their designs were optimized for compliance and stability. Mercedes' concept appeared optimized for exploitation and inevitability. That difference alone explains why the concern isn't loud, but persistent. What makes this situation especially difficult is that the advantage doesn't announce itself in a single data point. There is no obvious spike in peak horsepower. No dramatic dyno graph that screams dominance. Instead, the gain is distributed. Across acceleration phases. Across deployment windows. Across efficiency at moments where rivals assumed everyone would be equal. It's the kind of advantage that only becomes clear when you overlay entire laps, not individual sectors. And by the time teams see it clearly, they've already committed to architectures that can't be undone. Several insiders describe the Mercedes approach as front-loaded risk. All the danger is taken early. Before the public sees anything. Before the FIA feels pressure to intervene. Before rivals feel justified in copying. Once the concept is validated, the risk collapses, and what remains is momentum. That's why this strategy feels familiar to people who lived through previous regulation resets. Not identical, but emotionally similar. There's also a human factor that rarely gets discussed. When engineers realize a rival may have found something fundamental, doubt spreads faster than solutions. Development meetings change tone. Conversations shift from optimization to justification. And once doubt enters the room, efficiency drops. Mercedes appears insulated from that phase. They already paid the psychological cost when they chose this direction. Others are paying it now, much closer to the deadline. Another layer of complexity comes from reliability. Running an engine that behaves differently at operating temperature isn't just about power. It's about control. About managing thermal stress over race distances. About confidence in materials that are operating at the very edge of their design envelope. If Mercedes gets this right, it doesn't just gain performance. It gains freedom. Freedom to push harder earlier in races, knowing the margins were designed that way from the start. This is why early race behavior will matter more than outright results. Who pushes deployment aggressively? Who runs conservative modes? Who looks like they're protecting components rather than exploiting them? Those choices will reveal more about the underlying concepts than any lap-time headline ever could. And Mercedes is expected to show a level of operational confidence that others may struggle to match. All of this leads to a conclusion that remains deliberately incomplete. Mercedes' engine advantage, if real, isn't a trick waiting to be banned. It's a philosophy embedded so deeply into the project that removing it would mean rewriting the entire approach to 2026. That's why the fear around it feels different. It's not fear of cheating. It's fear of being late. And in Formula One, being late is often worse than being wrong. As this understanding spreads, the conversation inside the paddock quietly changes direction. Teams stop asking whether Mercedes has found an advantage. They start asking when it will become undeniable. Because advantages like this don't explode onto the scene. They seep in. They alter assumptions race by race, forcing rivals to explain why gaps persist even when variables look equal. And once explanations replace optimism, the psychological balance of a new era begins to tilt. One of the most destabilizing aspects of Mercedes' engine concept is how it interacts with the rest of the 2026 package. The power unit is no longer an isolated component. It dictates energy deployment. It influences aerodynamic choices. It even shapes how aggressively active aerodynamics can be used without compromising reliability. If Mercedes' engine truly behaves differently under load, it unlocks freedom elsewhere. Freedom that rivals may never realize they're missing until they see it used against them. This is where the advantage becomes political as much as technical. Because once a team demonstrates that a legal interpretation delivers consistent performance, every other manufacturer faces scrutiny. Sponsors ask questions. Boards demand explanations. Why didn't we see this? Why didn't we commit earlier? Why does catching up suddenly look so expensive? Those questions don't stay internal for long. They reshape how teams allocate blame, and how quickly confidence erodes at the top. What also complicates matters is that the cost cap removes the traditional safety valve. In previous eras, a team that realized it was behind could spend its way back into relevance. That option no longer exists. Now, spending more simply means spending earlier. And Mercedes already did that. They absorbed the risk when it was quiet, when no one was watching closely. Now others are staring at a narrowing window, wondering if any move they make can still change the outcome. There is also a timing element that adds urgency to the fear. Once engines are homologated, development freedom collapses. Conceptual corrections become impossible. You're left refining what you already committed to. If Mercedes' advantage is baked into the architecture itself, not an add-on, then rivals aren't chasing performance. They're chasing a locked door. And locked doors in Formula One tend to stay locked until the rules change again. This is why early season behavior in 2026 will be analyzed obsessively. Not just by fans, but by teams watching each other for signs of belief or doubt. Who looks like they're managing an advantage? Who looks like they're protecting weaknesses? Who sounds calm on the radio? Who sounds like they're improvising? Those details will tell a far clearer story than qualifying gaps ever could. And this brings the narrative to its most uncomfortable edge. Mercedes' secret advantage, if it exists in the way insiders suggest, doesn't need to dominate immediately to succeed. It only needs to persist, to survive scrutiny, to remain legal, to quietly force rivals into decisions that weaken them over time. Because once that process starts, the outcome doesn't hinge on one race or one season. It becomes structural. And structural advantages are the hardest ones Formula One has ever learned to undo. As this dynamic settles in, something else becomes clear to the teams watching closely. If Mercedes' advantage truly exists at this level, it changes how risk is defined in Formula One. Risk is no longer about trying something radical. It's about not trying something radical early enough. And that inversion is deeply unsettling for organizations built on incremental progress and cautious validation. Mercedes appears to have inverted the logic entirely. They accepted maximum uncertainty early so they could enjoy minimum uncertainty later. This is why so much attention is focused on how calm Mercedes appears as deadlines approach. There is no visible rush. No public talk of contingency plans. No messaging about learning years once 2026 begins. That absence speaks volumes. Teams that expect turbulence usually prepare the narrative in advance. Teams that expect stability don't need to. Mercedes' communication suggests a belief that the hardest decisions are already behind them, not ahead. Another uncomfortable implication starts to emerge at this point. If the engine behaves differently at operating temperature, then software strategy becomes more powerful. Energy deployment maps, thermal management algorithms, recovery timing. All of these become sharper tools when the hardware underneath them behaves predictably under extreme conditions. That compounds the advantage. It's no longer just mechanical. It's systemic. And systemic advantages are almost impossible to isolate without tearing the whole project apart. Rivals understand this, which is why discussions about copying the concept are already fading in some quarters. The question is no longer, can we replicate it? It's, what does replication actually mean at this stage? Because copying the idea without copying the philosophy leads nowhere. You inherit the risk without inheriting the certainty. And under a cost cap, half commitment is often worse than doing nothing at all. There's also a long-term fear that goes beyond championships. If one manufacturer demonstrates that extreme regulatory literalism is rewarded, it changes how future rules are written. It forces regulators to close gaps more aggressively. It increases complexity. And complexity raises costs across the board. Ironically, an advantage designed within a cost cap could end up increasing pressure on the entire system. That's why this issue resonates beyond Mercedes' immediate rivals. It touches the governance of the sport itself. Inside the FIA, this creates a delicate balancing act. Intervening too early looks like punishment for competence. Intervening too late looks like surrender. And waiting for proof means accepting that by the time proof exists, the competitive damage may already be done. Mercedes hasn't forced this dilemma. They've simply exposed it. By committing fully to the rules as written, they've tested how robust those rules really are under pressure. And this is where the story deliberately refuses to close. Because Mercedes' secret engine advantage isn't a headline waiting to break. It's a process still unfolding. A set of decisions whose consequences will only become clear once they're irreversible. The grid hasn't seen the full picture yet. But the fact that so many teams are already adjusting behavior tells you something important. They don't need confirmation anymore. They just need to know how much time they have left before the advantage stops being theoretical and starts defining the era.